Okay, so I'm talking about the Iron Gates, and if there is anyone here who doesn't know where the Iron Gates is, oops, we'll go back again. Very simple definition of the Iron Gates. It's the section of the Danube Valley which forms the border between Serbia and Romania. So you've got a 230 kilometre long section. The first part of it is where the river cuts through the Carpathian Balkan mountains, so it's the Iron Gates Gorge, and then it comes out the other side and starts to flow across the Wallachian plain. So there are really two bits of the Iron Gates. There's a mountainous bit with a gorge-like environment, and then there's a much more open, lower relief landscape that you get downstream. And within that area, because they built dams at the exit from the Iron Gates Gorge and then about 80 kilometres downriver, where there's a big island in the river called Big Island, surprisingly. A second dam was built in the 1980s. And in advance of the construction of those dams, or while they were being constructed, archaeologists did survey work on both flanks of the Danube and discovered something like 50 sites which had Mesolithic or early Neolithic, and very often both Mesolithic and early Neolithic occupation on them. So this is why the Iron Gates is a critically important area for studying the transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic in southeastern Europe. Now, the picture that emerged immediately after the excavations by Srejovic and Boranance in Romania in the Iron Gates was a very simple model where this whole sequence, we have this rich record from about 12,500 BC through to about 5,500 BC, and it was seen by archaeologists in the 1970s that it began with nomadic hunter-gatherers occupying caves on the margins of the Iron Gates, hunting large mammals. And then sometime around about the end of the early Holocene, they started to settle down in open-air camps on the banks of the Danube and concentrate on fishing. And they became so successful at fishing that way of life survived long after farming was introduced to this region. So that's the kind of 1960s model of the Mesolithic-Neolithic transition in the Iron Gates. But, of course, things move on. You can't really get to many of these sites anymore because they're flooded. But lots of material survives in museums, in archaeological institutes in Belgrade and Bucharest. And we've, of course, had what I call the isotopic revolution in archaeology with the introduction of accelerated dating, HAEMUS dating, which allows us to date very small samples from individual artifacts or individual bones or carbonized seeds. And it's also been possible to do some work at one site in the Iron Gates and a little bit at another site, Vlasac, where Dusan Boric has been working in Serbia. A little bit of work was possible on those parts of the site that weren't flooded. But at Skela Kladove, on the Romanian bank, which is downstream from the Iron Gates Gorge, you've got a site that stretches for about a kilometre along the river bank, where you can still access this site. This is very unusual in the Iron Gates. And I've been working there since 1991, first with Vasily Boranance, who unfortunately died last year, and now with his daughter. So it's 25 years of messing around at Skela Kladove. And in addition to the excavations at Skela Kladove and Vlasac, of course, it's been possible to apply HAEMUS dating and stable isotope analysis to human bone, animal bone, and bone artifacts from these sites. And the stable isotopes, of course, tells us not just about the diet, but it tells us about migration patterns. And a lot of new information has come out of that. And it's changed the entire picture of the Mesolithic-Neolithic transition in the Iron Gates. It's completely revolutionized the chronology. We don't have to believe in the chronology that Srejovic had to believe in and Boranance had to believe in, which was based mainly on stratigraphy and typology. HAEMUS dating has replaced all that. We have a lot of new information about burial practices. Our understanding of the settlement pattern has changed and mobility has changed. We know a lot more about exchange systems that were going on in the Mesolithic and through into the early Neolithic. And of course, we know much more about diet. And one of the things we know from stable isotopes is that the Mesolithic diet was very dependent upon fish from the Danube. And therefore, they have very heavy nitrogen and carbon values. So all these are late Paleolithic and Mesolithic individuals here, all fall in that time range. They're very often buried in this extended on the back body position. Whereas in the early Neolithic, you find much lighter carbon and nitrogen values in this range, and people were typically buried in the crouch position, lying on left side or right side. So that's a very important thing. Now, let's come to Scala Cladovi, which is the one site that you can really still get to. Now, I've worked there for, as I say, on and off for the last 25 years. And what we have at Scala Cladovi is a late Mesolithic occupation, and then an early Neolithic occupation, and then later on Iron Age and medieval occupations on that site. And our late Mesolithic occupation began around 7,100 Cal BC and ran through to about 6,300. Then there was a gap in our radiocarbon sequence of about 300 years, and then around about 6,000 BC, we have an early Neolithic occupation that lasted for about 400 years. And you can see it very clearly. These little circles represent mean radiocarbon ages. So, unfortunately, because of this gap, we don't really know when the transition from Mesolithic hunting and gathering to Neolithic farming began. But what we do know is that the farmers who occupied this site after 6,000 BC had a very different material culture and a very different economy. So we have our first domesticates on the site. We have a whole range of new technology, new bone tools, new kinds of beads, flat discoidal beads, not the what we were seeing in the first lecture in this session, little shell beads. We don't get those. Lots of new kinds of stone artifacts, polished stone axes, grindstones, little notched weights, which are probably fishing weights of some kind. Use of exotic materials like Balkan flint and obsidian, which we didn't see in the Mesolithic, and of course pottery. And new architecture, the Mesolithic architecture of these trapezoidal plan buildings. In the Neolithic, we go to rectangular plan buildings, but interestingly, there's still pit houses on this site. Use of non-local materials, as I said, Balkan flint, and of course a change in burial practices with crouch burials instead of extended supine burials. So a big question is, what happened here between 6,300 and 6,000 BC? Clearly the transition to the Neolithic happened. But when did it happen? Did it happen closer to 6,300 or closer to 6,000? Well, our gap at Scala Cladovi isn't confined to that site. It's a regional phenomenon. It coincides with the 8.2 Ka event, this cold event. There's an earlier gap that we get to about 9.3 Ka, where there was another cold event of the Holocene. So something happens in the Iron Gates during these cold events, and during the 8.2 something happened. Nothing very remarkable. We haven't got time to go into this. But probably it's to do with increased flooding along the Danube and people just not putting their houses right on the bank of the river. They moved back. They're still there, and we know they're still there because at Lipensky Via, this is the one site where you have a lot of evidence for human activity in that 300, 400 year period around the 8.2 Ka event. And all the things we regard as special about Lipensky Via, the plaster-floored trapezoidal houses, the carved boulders, those things appear around this time. We also have, in that period, we have pottery, we have polished stone axes, we have both crouch burials, and we have extended on the back supine Mesolithic tradition burials, Balkan flint, flat discoidal beads, and of course livestock. All that in that 400-year period. Now, we have to say here that a lot of the dating that's been done has been done on human bone. We have about 80, 85 radiocarbon dates now from the Iron Gates, all on human bone. We have a big problem with dating human bone because whether you were Mesolithic or whether you were an early Neolithic person, you ate a lot of fish. And when you eat a lot of fish, it means your bones are depleted in carbon-14. So the dates that we get off the bones tend to be too old by a factor of up to 500, 550 years. It's a reservoir effect like the marine reservoir effect, but bigger. And we can correct for it to some extent. We can use the nitrogen value as a marker of how much fish is going into the diet, and we can correct. And we can see here's a bone projectile point sticking into the pelvis of a late Mesolithic individual from Scala Cladovae, and there's a hole there where another bone projectile point was at one time sticking in. And we can compare the date off the bone projectile point, which is probably made from a red deer bone, which is a herbivore living on a terrestrial diet, with the date from the human bone, where the individual was eating a lot of fish. And you can see the difference in age. So we have to make this correction. The problem is in making that correction, we end up with a radiocarbon age which is closer to the truth, a calibrated age which is closer to the truth, but is much less precise. The error gets bigger. And this is our problem. We've got all these human remains dated from that 6,300, 6,000 BC period, but our radiocarbon dates become very imprecise. On top of that, we've got two plateaux in the radiocarbon calibration curve, which doesn't help. It makes everything less precise. So we've got a problem with dating. So going back to Lipensky and the transition to farming in this region, when did it happen? Well, what can we say at Lipensky belongs to the period after 6,000 BC, belongs to the Neolithic proper? Well, again, that's rather difficult because there are some things you can't date. But I would say that all these things, pottery, polished stone axes, Balkan flint, crouch burials, and the domesticates, we've got no evidence, no very good evidence that any of that appears there before 6,000 BC. It may do, but we can't say for certain. What we can also say, there are some Mesolithic traditions that continue after 6,000 BC. One is fishing. People still fish in the early Neolithic. They don't do it to the same extent as the Mesolithic people, but they're still eating fish. The trapezoidal plan buildings and the extended burials, the Mesolithic tradition burials, go on after 6,000 BC for a little while. How long is a bit of an open question. What at Lipensky that's Neolithic, or what we would say is Neolithic, falls before 6,000 BC? Well, the obvious thing that comes before 6,000 BC are the flat discoidal beads, the things we see at Scala Cladovae after 6,000 BC. We've got these, the discoidal beads. They occur with burials, Vlasats and Lipensky, which are dated to between about 6,000 and 6,100. But bear in mind, these dates, they're on human bone, and they're not that precise. So we've got these ornaments. There's a change in ornaments. We've got spondylus shell beads at Vlasats. We've got the flat discoidal beads. And they're found, importantly, with Mesolithic tradition extended burials. Now, a year ago, looking at that data, I said, well, what does that mean? And a year ago, the answer I would have given you is it doesn't necessarily mean that we've got the Neolithic at Lipensky, that we've got farmers, or we've got Mesolithic people who became farmers, still using their traditional practices. All this need indicate is that this is contact with farmers. You know, they've got contact with farmers, and just as the paper we had earlier about shell beads from Croatia, we can just have exchange going on between hunter-gatherers and farmers. But then it gets more complicated. Okay, if you want exchange to be going on, if you want to go back before 6,200 BC, to find the full-blown Neolithic, you probably have to go around to the Circum-Aegean area. There's not much north of Greece that you can push back, in my view anyway, before 6,200. What's north of Greece in this area up here, 6,000, 6,100 maximum in radiocarbon terms. So that's where the farmers were. So do we have long distance exchange going on? You know, it's possible. Obsidian was moving over 400 or 500 kilometers. Balkan flint was moving over 500 or 600 kilometers in the early Neolithic. You could have long distance exchange. However, coming back to the iron gates and stabilized stopes and radiocarbon, we've known for a number of years that, because we've done this at Lipensky, we've dated skeletons in this time range, 6,300 to 6,000. We've done stabilized stopes. Most of the people we've looked at have very heavy carbon and nitrogen isotope values, suggesting they were doing a lot of fishing and not eating much terrestrial food. But there are three individuals that we found, these two, burial 54E and 54C, and burial 26, who have Neolithic type diets in their stabilized stopes. These are buried in the Mesolithic tradition, have Neolithic type diets. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that we're looking at people, Mesolithic people, who belong to the period between 6,000 6,300 at a time when farming has begun in this area? Or are these people who have moved in at some point in their lives to live among the community at Lipensky? And they've changed, they've started off originating in the Neolithic community, they've moved into Lipensky or the Lipensky area, they've died and been buried at Lipensky. So they could be incomers or they could be local people who become farmers. Now, more recently, here's another burial from Lipensky, one of the most famous burials from Lipensky. This is burial 7, famous because it's well preserved. He's got a second skull sitting on his left shoulder and an aurochs skull sitting on his right shoulder. And I've often looked at this hole in the middle of the aurochs skull and wondered if that animal was poleaxed. Well, that's a totally different question, a totally different issue. Now, okay, we've got a date in our 6,300 to 6,000 BC period. Yeah, I know we're coming up. This is the end almost, right? Now, this has taught me a very important lesson. When you do stabilized stopes on human skeletons, never just do one bone. Right? Which everybody does, and I did for many years. We just do one bone. The problem is that different bones in the skeleton have a different collagen turnover rate. Right? If you stabilize it over a femur or an arm bone, it probably takes 30 or 40 years or more for the bone, the chemical signal to change if you change your diet. And if you're taking the collagen out of that femur, which is what we did in this burial, you're probably looking at the diet of that individual around the time they were in their late teens or 20s, and you're assuming the diet doesn't change. If you want to look at what happened recently in the diet of an individual, then go for another bone where the turnover is much more rapid, and go for a rib. Now, ribs are good because you don't destroy too much if you do ribs. So we know this is a local individual from the strontium. This is an individual who was born and raised on the Danube. That was our stabilized stope value for the femur. Very heavy, that's a bog standard Mesolithic signal. And 7,700, we'll have to correct that. And then, I didn't do this, Gisela Grupper did this, but they only found out it was from this skeleton and it was a rib recently. And they've done that. Look at the difference in the stabilized stope values. So this is an individual who changed diet between the time they were 20 and the time they died, and changed diet substantially from a Mesolithic type diet to a Neolithic type diet. Now, are you seeing there the transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic within the lifetime of one individual? Well, you may be. On the other hand, that's the most likely interpretation. You can't rule out, I don't suppose, the fact that this was an individual who probably lived at Lipensky and grew up at Lipensky and then moved to live with a farming community down south or wherever and then was brought back for burial. That's a possibility. It's a less likely possibility. Carrying a dead body through the Balkans for burial at Lepenskivir. Theoretically possible, not very likely. So I think that's an interesting find. Now, just very finally, this is my last slide. 2 sites, Lepenskivir here in the gorge, Velesnica, dug by Rasko Vazic back in the 1980s in the downstream area. We did radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analysis of both Lepenskivir and Velesnica. The oldest Neolithic burials in terms of their diet at these 2 sites are the same age. And there they are. Velesnica, the radiocarbon dates are falling before 6000 BC, around about 6050, 6025 BC. And at Velesnica, they're buried in the crouched position. So this is bog standard, Starchevo culture, crouch burials at Velesnica. And at Lepenskivir, at the same time, we've got people being buried in the Mesolithic tradition, lying on their backs, but they have broadly the same diet. So I'm going to, there are no conclusions from this. It's a kind of work in progress, but I think burial 7 at Lepenskivir is very interesting. So anyway, thank you to all the organisers and whoever I've nicked photographs from this presentation. Thank you very much.